The ship was enormous. It was so large that when Ambassador Reina Vasquez first saw it through the window of the transport shuttle, she thought it was a moon. But it was not a moon. It was a space station, the grand conclave of the galactic sovereignty, and it had been floating in orbit around a quiet, unnamed star for over 12,000 years. Reina pressed her face gently against the cold glass and stared at it. The station was shaped like a flower with 100 petals, each petal a different color, each one belonging to a different member species of the sovereignty. Lights blinked softly across its surface. Ships of all sizes moved around it like tiny fish circling a whale. It was, without any doubt, the most impressive thing she had ever seen in her life. She pulled back from the glass and straightened her jacket. "Stop looking so amazed," said Marcus Chen from the seat beside her. He was her junior diplomat, 29 years old, always cheerful, always carrying a tablet that was covered in sticky notes. "They'll think we've never seen anything big before." "We haven't," Reina said, "not like this." "Fair point." Marcus went back to reading something on his tablet. There were 5 humans total on the shuttle. Reina was the lead ambassador. Marcus was her assistant. Then there was Dr. Peter Havley, a legal expert who had spent 20 years studying interstellar law even before humanity had confirmed there was anyone else out there to make laws with. There was also Commander Sira Akafer, a calm and observant woman from Earth's newly formed Space Diplomatic Corps. And finally, there was a young translator named Jin Park, who had learned 4 alien languages in 2 years and was currently muttering vocabulary words under his breath. They had been traveling for 11 days. Their escort was a Veil ship. The Veil were tall, silver-skinned, and had 4 arms. They moved in slow, deliberate ways, like people who had never once been in a hurry in their long lives. Their lead diplomat was called High Emissary Sorvelon, and he had met the humans at Earth's outer orbital station with a polite smile that never quite reached his large golden eyes. He had told them very gently that the induction ceremony was a tradition, that it was simple, that it had been done 47 times before and had never taken more than a few hours. Sign the papers, take the photographs, welcome to the galaxy. Reina had smiled and said, "Of course." Then she had asked for a copy of the treaty to read on the way. Sorvelon had paused for just a moment. Then he had smiled again and handed over the document file. It was 847 pages long. The Grand Conclave Station smelled like something between a forest and a library. The air was filtered to support dozens of different species, which meant it had a faint, strange sweetness to it that humans found oddly pleasant. The ceilings were tall. The corridors were wide. Everything was made from a pale material that glowed softly, like stone that had swallowed a little bit of sunlight. Reina and her team were given a suite of rooms near the outer ring of the station. The furniture was designed for multiple body types, which made it look strange but was actually comfortable once you figured out which part was a chair. There was a long window that looked out into open space. Stars hung outside like scattered salt. The ceremony was scheduled for the next morning. The treaty file sat open on Reina's tablet. She poured herself a cup of hot tea from a small machine in the corner, sat down at the desk, and began to read. Page 1 was a preamble. It talked about peace, unity, shared prosperity. It used very beautiful language. Reina highlighted 3 phrases that sounded good but meant nothing specific. Page 12 introduced the resource-sharing framework. Member species were required to submit annual reports on all planetary resources and make a percentage available for collective sovereignty use. The percentage was not fixed. It could be adjusted by the Sovereignty Council. There was no cap mentioned anywhere. Reina underlined that, wrote a note beside it: who sets the adjustment, what limits. She kept reading. By page 40, she had filled 2 full pages of her own notes. By page 100, she had started a separate document just for her questions. By page 200, Dr. Peta had woken up, seen the light under Reina's door, and knocked softly. Raina let her in. Peeta read page 219, went very still, and then said quietly, "This clause basically lets them take a planet back if it misses a resource quota." "I know," Raina said. Peeta sat down. She did not go back to sleep. By the time the station's artificial dawn light turned on, all 5 humans were awake, seated around the long desk, and Raina's notes had grown into a document that was 312 pages long. The ceremony hall was beautiful. It had high ceilings painted with the symbols of every member species. 47 different flags, or the alien equivalent of flags, hung from the walls. The seats were filled with representatives from dozens of worlds, all dressed in formal clothing of every color and cut imaginable. Some had scales, some had fur, some had neither. Some were breathing a gas mixture that required small masks. All of them were watching. Sorvelon stood at the front in a white ceremonial robe. He gestured warmly to the human delegation and to the long table where the treaty waited. It was printed on a heavy, dark material, not paper exactly, but something solid and permanent. The kind of thing meant to last thousands of years. The room was quiet and expectant. Raina walked to the table. She picked up the treaty. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it back down and placed her own document beside it. "We have reviewed the standard induction treaty," she said clearly. "We would like to submit 312 pages of proposed amendments before we sign." The silence that followed was not the polite, expectant kind. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room is too surprised to make any noise at all. Somewhere near the back, something that sounded like a glass fell and shattered. Sorvelon stood completely still. He looked at the document on the table. He looked at Raina. He looked at the document again. His 4 hands were folded very carefully at his sides, which Raina had already learned was what the veil did when they were trying not to show a strong emotion. "You have amendments," he said. "Yes," Raina said. "Quite a few. Clause 219 alone required 8 pages of notes." The murmuring that moved through the hall sounded like wind through tall grass. Representatives leaned toward each other. Some used translation devices held to their ears. Some simply stared. Sorvelon turned very slowly to his aide, who was a younger Veil standing just behind him. He leaned close and spoke in a voice so low that only the aide could hear it. But Jin Park was standing nearby, and Jin Park was very good at his job. He leaned toward Raina and whispered, "He just said alert the council. The humans have read it." Raina nodded slowly. She picked up her tea, which she had brought in a sealed travel cup, and took a calm sip. "We read everything," she said to no one in particular. Outside the tall windows of the hall, the stars drifted by, quiet and indifferent, as the oldest political institution in the known galaxy tried very hard to figure out what to do next. News traveled fast in the galaxy. Faster than light, in fact, because the sovereignty had communication relays spread across thousands of star systems, and information moved through them the way electricity moves through wire, instantly and in every direction at once. Within 6 hours of the ceremony, every major world in the galactic sovereignty knew what had happened. Humans had rejected the standard induction treaty. Not with weapons, not with a war fleet parked outside the station, not with threats or anger or any of the things that the sovereignty's security protocols had been designed to handle. They had rejected it with a 312-page document full of legal questions, politely worded objections, and very specific requests for clarification. On the Veil homeworld, the High Council called an emergency session at midnight. On the Kreth homeworld, a hot, rocky planet covered in ancient fortresses, a general named War Master Drak stopped in the middle of a training exercise, read the news report twice, and then stood very still for a long time while his soldiers watched him nervously. On the small, cold planet of Sen Prime, an elderly archivist named Bell II pulled a very old document from a sealed storage unit that had not been opened in 400 years. She blew the dust off the cover and began to read her own species' original induction treaty for the very first time. Across the galaxy, in offices and council chambers and quiet homes and busy markets, the same question was being asked in 47 different languages. Could they do that? Inside the Grand Conclave, the human delegation had turned their guest suite into something that looked less like diplomatic quarters and more like the back room of a very intense university study group. There were handwritten notes stuck to the window glass. There were diagrams drawn on the wide walls using a marker that Marcus had found in his bag. There were food wrappers, protein bars, mostly floating in the low gravity near the ceiling because no one had time to chase them down. 3 empty tea pouches drifted past the door every time it opened. Marcus was seated cross-legged on the floor with 2 tablets balanced on his knees and a third propped against a cushion. He had discovered something. "Okay," he said loudly, and everyone looked at him. Article 88 and Article 152 directly contradict each other. Dr. Peta looked up from her own tablet. How? Article 88 says member species retain full sovereignty over their home star system. Article 152 says the Sovereignty Council has the right to establish navigational control zones anywhere in sovereignty space, which includes member home systems, without requiring member consent. There was a pause. "That's not a small contradiction," Commander Sierra said from the corner, where she had been quietly building a timeline of all the treaty's most questionable clauses on a portable display. "No," Marcus agreed. "It's a pretty big one. I found 6 more like it." Jin Park raised his hand slightly. "I found 2 in the language provisions alone. One paragraph says all official communications must be in the species' native language upon request. Another says the sovereignty language is the binding legal standard for all disputes, so if there's ever a disagreement about what a word means, human opinion doesn't count." Raina wrote that down. She had been writing almost without stopping since the ceremony. Her hand was starting to ache, but she kept going. "We're not trying to burn this place down," she said, more to herself than to the others. "We just want a fair deal." "I know," Peta said, "but I don't think they understand that yet." High Emissary Sorvellon had not slept. He had spent the night in a series of urgent meetings with senior sovereignty officials who had used phrases like unprecedented disruption and existential challenge to our legal framework. And how did no one check if the humans would actually read it? The last phrase had been said by a very tired bureaucrat who immediately looked embarrassed about saying it out loud. By morning, a plan had been formed. Sorvellon would go and speak with the humans personally. He would be calm, dignified, and persuasive. He would explain the importance of the tradition. He would appeal to humanity's desire to be part of something larger than themselves. He would offer minor cosmetic adjustments, perhaps a symbolic amendment to 1 or 2 small clauses, and guide them gently toward a signature. He had done this before in different forms with 3 other species who had shown mild hesitation. It had always worked. He straightened his ceremonial robe, composed his expression into one of patient authority, and walked to the human delegation's quarters. He knocked. Raina opened the door. She was holding a cup of tea. There was a sticky note on her sleeve that said Clause 311, check. She had not noticed it was there. "High Emissary," she said warmly, "please come in." He stepped inside and immediately had to move sideways to avoid a floating protein bar wrapper. He looked around the room at the notes on the windows, the diagrams on the walls, and Marcus Chen, who waved at him cheerfully from the floor without looking up from his tablets. Sorvellon had been a diplomat for 300 years. He had walked into rooms on dozens of worlds. He had negotiated with species who breathed methane, species who communicated through color changes in their skin, species who considered silence the highest form of respect. He had never, in 300 years, walked into a room and felt quite this unsettled. "Ambassador Vasquez," he began carefully, "I want you to understand the significance of the Standard Induction Treaty. It is not merely a legal document. It is a symbol of. It has a clause that lets you repossess a planet," Reina said. Sorvellan paused. Clause 219 is a resource compliance mechanism that has never been. "It exists," Reina said. "Whether it's been used or not, it exists, and we're not signing something that says you can take our planet if we miss a quota." She said it without anger. She said it the way a person states a very obvious and simple fact, like the sky being blue or water being wet. Sorvellan looked at her for a long moment. He had expected fear. He had expected awe. He had expected the small, nervous energy of a young species standing at the door of something enormous and ancient. Instead, she looked completely comfortable. Mildly tired, perhaps, but comfortable. "Our counter-treaty is quite reasonable," she added. "We kept most of the original framework. We just removed the parts that don't make sense and fixed the contradictions." From the floor, Marcus raised a hand. There were 9 of those. 11, Peeta corrected from across the room. Sorvellan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Before he could say anything, his personal communicator vibrated. He looked at it. Then he looked at it again because he thought he had misread it. He had not misread it. 3 species, the Kreth, the Sen, and the small aquatic civilization known as the Duvari, had just filed formal objections to clauses in their own existing treaties with the sovereignty, citing the human delegation's review process as a legal precedent for the right to do so. Sorvellan stood in the middle of the human delegation's chaotic, note-covered room, and for the first time in 300 years, he had absolutely no idea what to say. Reina glanced at the expression on his face. "Do you want some tea?" she asked. "It helps." The negotiations had been going on for 3 weeks. This was, by every measure the galactic sovereignty had, impossible. The induction process for a new species was supposed to last 1 day. There were protocols for it. There were catering arrangements for it. The hall was traditionally booked for exactly 4 hours, including the reception afterward. No one had ever needed to book it for longer than that. The sovereignty's scheduling office had sent a polite message to the human delegation on day 4 asking when they expected to be finished. Marcus Chen had sent back a reply that said, cheerfully, "Hard to say. We found another contradiction." The scheduling office had not responded after that. By the 3rd week, the negotiations had their own rhythm. Every morning, Reina and her team sent a new round of questions and proposed language to the sovereignty's legal office. Every afternoon, the legal office sent back formal responses that gradually became less formal and more desperate. Every evening, Sorvellan stopped by the human delegation's quarters for what had somehow become a daily meeting over tea. He told himself it was his professional duty. He told himself he was keeping a close eye on the situation. But the truth, which he would not have admitted to anyone, was that he had started to find the conversations interesting. He had also, quietly and alone in his own quarters late at night, started reading the treaty himself, not as a professional exercise, not to prepare arguments, just reading, the way the humans did it, slowly, carefully, and with a willingness to ask at the end of each page, "Does this make sense?" Often, he was surprised to find that it did not. The history of the Standard Induction Treaty went back a long way. Sorvellan knew the official version. Every diplomat did. The founding 5, the first 5 species to achieve interstellar travel, had written the treaty 12,000 years ago as a framework for peace. It was a noble act, a generous one. They had opened the door to every species that came after them, and the galaxy had grown and connected and become something larger than any one world could have made it. That was the official version. The version Sorvellan found in the deep archive files that were technically accessible but practically forgotten, stored in formats so old that he needed a specialized program to read them, was more complicated. The original treaty had 2 drafts. The first draft was balanced. It gave all member species equal legal standing, equal representation on the Council, and equal protection under sovereignty law. It was, by any honest reading, a fair document. The second draft, which became the standard induction treaty that every species had been signing for 12,000 years, was different. The changes were subtle. They were buried in legal language that sounded the same on the surface but meant something different underneath. Equal representation had been adjusted to weighted representation, where the founding 5 each held permanent senior seats. Resource-sharing protections had been quietly removed. The clause about planetary repossession had been added in the final revision, listed under a heading that called it an economic stability provision. The founding 5 had looked at that first fair draft and made it smaller, made it safer, for themselves. Sorvelon sat alone in his quarters with the archive files open on his screen. He read the 2 drafts side by side for a long time. Outside his window, the stars were the same as they always were. They did not look different, but something felt different anyway. He thought about the 47 species who had signed the second draft. He thought about whether any of them had read it the way the humans had read it. He thought about whether any of them had felt, somewhere quietly, that something was wrong and had simply not known they were allowed to say so. War Master Drak arrived at the Grand Conclave on day 18. He was a large being. The Kreth were built like ancient tanks, wide-scaled, with thick arms and small, sharp eyes that had seen too many things. He wore no ceremonial clothing. He wore his military uniform, which was dark and plain and covered in the kind of wear that only came from actual use, not decoration. He had requested a meeting with the human delegation directly. No sovereignty mediator, no official record, just a conversation. Raina met him in a small side room off the main corridor. She brought Marcus, who she trusted completely, and told everyone else to stay back. Drak sat across the table from her. He was nearly twice her height, even seated. He looked at her with those sharp eyes for a moment before speaking. 800 years ago, he said without introduction, the Kreth signed the Standard Induction Treaty. At the time, we were still rebuilding after a long internal war. We were tired. We wanted peace. We were told the treaty was the gateway to that peace. He paused. Under Clause 44B of the treaty, all Kreth military movements outside our home system require advance approval from the Sovereignty Council. Raina nodded slowly. That's a significant limitation. We have not been able to move a single ship beyond our outer planets without filing paperwork for 800 years, Drak said. His voice was flat. We did not fight it. We did not question it. It was the treaty. The treaty was the treaty. He looked at his hands on the table. Last week, for the first time, I read Clause 44B carefully. I read the clauses around it. I found that the same restriction does not apply to any of the founding 5 species. Their militaries move freely. His eyes came back up to Raina's face. We signed something that treated us differently, and we never noticed, or perhaps we noticed and believed we had no right to speak. The room was quiet. I want to know, Drak said, and his voice was lower now, almost careful, how you knew, how your people knew they were allowed to say no. Raina thought about it honestly. She did not give him a grand answer. She did not talk about human history or legal philosophy or centuries of revolutions. She just told him the truth. We didn't know we were allowed, she said. We just did it anyway. Not saying no when something is wrong, that has always felt worse to us than whatever comes after. Drak was silent for a long time. The ventilation in the small room hummed softly. Somewhere far away, a door opened and closed. I think, Drak said finally, that my people forgot something very important a long time ago. He stood slowly, and his full height filled the room. I am going to read our treaty again, all of it, every page. He looked at Raina. I may have questions. Come by any time, she said. We have tea. After he left, Marcus let out a slow breath. That was heavy. Yes, Raina agreed. She looked out the small window at the edge of the room. The station turned slowly around them. Somewhere on this station, in a closed room with no windows, the Founding Five were meeting. She did not know exactly what they were saying, but she had a feeling she would find out soon. She was right. That same evening, a sealed message arrived from the Sovereignty Council. It was addressed to her personally, and it carried the official seal of all 5 founding species. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she set it down very calmly and said, "Marcus, call everyone in. We need to talk." The message was polite. That was the most frightening thing about it. It did not use the language of threats. It did not raise its voice or pound a table or describe what weapons the sovereignty could deploy. It was written in the calm, smooth language of people who had held power for 12,000 years and had never once needed to shout because the universe had always simply done what they wanted. The message said, in careful and formal terms, that the galactic sovereignty deeply valued humanity's interest in joining the interstellar community. It said that the Standard Induction Treaty represented a sacred and time-honored tradition of cooperation. It said that the Sovereignty Council had, after careful deliberation, concluded that further delay of the signing process was creating instability across member worlds. And then, in the final paragraph, still polite, still smooth, it said that a cooperative fleet of sovereignty vessels had been repositioned to the Sol system for the purpose of, and here it used a phrase that Raina read 3 times, ensuring the continued productive nature of diplomatic dialogue. 200 ships near Earth. Raina folded her hands on the table and looked at the 5 people seated around her. The room was very quiet. Marcus had stopped tapping on his tablet. Dr. Peta had taken off her glasses, which she only did when she was thinking very hard. Commander Sierra sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Jin Park was looking at the floor. "They parked 200 ships near our home planet," Marcus said, not as a question. "Yes," Raina said. "And they're calling it ensuring productive dialogue." "Yes." Sierra spoke without changing her expression. "How long before those ships could reach Earth?" "At standard sovereignty cruising speed from the repositioned coordinates," Jin said quietly. He had already done the calculation. 18 days. Another silence. Peta put her glasses back on. She looked at Raina directly. "What do you want to do?" Raina did not answer immediately. She stood up and walked to the window. The station rotated slowly. Stars slid past. Somewhere out there, past all that darkness, was a small blue planet with 8 billion people on it who did not know 200 warships were now parked in their neighborhood. She thought about fear. She understood it completely. She was not a reckless person and she was not a naive one. She knew what 200 ships meant. She knew the math of the situation was not comfortable. But she also thought about the treaty on the table. She thought about Clause 219, which could take a planet. She thought about Clause 44b, which had locked the Kreth in a cage for 800 years and called it peace. She thought about the 2 drafts in the archive, the fair one that was never used, and the smaller, tighter one that every species had been signing ever since. She turned back to the room. "Is our countertreaty fair?" she asked. The question was simple. Everyone knew the answer. "Yes," Peta said. "Without question," Sierra said. Marcus nodded. "It's actually a better deal for the sovereignty too in the long run. It just treats everyone equally." "Then we don't change a word of it," Raina said. She sat back down. She pulled out a fresh document on her tablet. "We are going to respond to this message. Not with anger, not with a counter-threat. We're going to write them a legal brief explaining why what they just did violates their own rules." Marcus blinked. They violated their own rules. "Article 7 of the Non-Coercion Statutes," Peta said slowly, and then her eyes widened slightly. "Which they wrote themselves in the 3rd century of the sovereignty. It prohibits the use or implied threat of military force as a tool in diplomatic negotiations between member and candidate species. She paused. They literally have a law against exactly what they just did. They've had it for 11,000 years, Reyna said. They've just never had anyone point it out to them. It took them 4 hours to write the brief. It was 3 pages long. It was not angry. It was not dramatic. It cited specific articles, specific clause numbers, specific dates. It explained, in plain and careful language, that the repositioning of the fleet near Sol constituted a violation of 4 separate provisions of the sovereignty's own founding charter. It requested, formally and politely, that the fleet be withdrawn in accordance with those provisions. It also noted, in a single sentence near the end, that a full copy of the brief was being transmitted simultaneously to all 47 member species of the Galactic sovereignty, as required under the Transparency of Diplomatic Process Act, Article 33. Reyna read it over one final time. "Send it," she said. Jin pressed the transmit button. The brief arrived across the galaxy like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples were immediate. On the Kreth homeworld, War Master Drak read the brief within 20 minutes of receiving it and forwarded it to every military commander in the Kreth fleet with a single attached note that said, "Read this. All of it." On Sen Prime, the elderly archivist Bell II, who was still working her way through her own original induction treaty, paused to read the human brief and then sat quietly for a moment before returning to her reading with renewed focus. On 14 other worlds, the brief was forwarded, discussed, copied, and shared through channels both official and not. Legal scholars who had spent careers studying sovereignty law looked up Article 7 and confirmed that the humans were exactly correct. On the sovereignty fleet near Sol, 200 ship captains received the brief. They were professional officers. They had their orders, but they also had access to the same legal database as everyone else, and several of them pulled up Article 7 within the hour. By that evening, the fleet's internal communications were reportedly very busy. In the Grand Conclave, the Founding Five's closed session ran for 9 hours. Sorvelon was not in the session. He had no seat there. He was a working diplomat, not a member of the Inner Council. He sat in the corridor outside because there was no rule that said he couldn't, and he waited. When the session ended, the officials walked past him without stopping. Their expressions were controlled and gave nothing away. That was normal. That was the Veil way. But Sorvelon had been a diplomat for 300 years, and he could read the things that expressions tried to hide. He saw the tension in the set of four-armed shoulders. He saw the speed of footsteps that were trying to appear unhurried. He saw 2 officials exchange a glance that lasted a fraction too long. The fleet near Sol was a problem now. It had always been a threat. Now it was also evidence. He walked back to his own office. He sat down. He looked at the blank screen in front of him for a long time. Then he opened a new document and began to write a letter of resignation. He did not write it quickly. He wrote it carefully, the way he did everything, and when it was finished, he read it once and then sent it before he could change his mind. He stood up. He felt surprisingly lighter than he had in years. He picked up his small personal bag. He had packed it already, though he had not consciously noticed himself doing it, and he walked out of his office and down the corridor toward the outer ring of the station, where the human delegation's quarters were. He knocked on the door. Reyna opened it. She looked at his bag. She looked at his face. "Come in," she said simply. He stepped inside. A protein bar wrapper drifted past his shoulder. The walls were still covered in notes. Marcus looked up. "Oh, are you staying for dinner?" "I think," Sorvelon said carefully, "that I may be changing sides." Reyna gestured to the chair that he had sat in every evening for 3 weeks, the one that had quietly become his chair. "Tea first," she said, "then we talk." Outside the window, The stars were steady and bright. Somewhere unseen, in the space between worlds, the fleet near Sol sat still and argued with itself about a 3-page document that had the nerve to be completely right. The fleet near Sol went home. There was no official announcement. There was no explanation given. One morning the ships were there, sitting at the edge of Earth's solar system like a quiet reminder of someone else's power, and the next morning the long-range sensors showed empty space. They had simply turned around and left, one by one, over the course of a single night. Earth's orbital monitoring stations tracked their departure and sent the data to Reyna on the Grand Conclave station. Marcus saw the report first. He walked into the main room where everyone was working, held up his tablet and said nothing. He just showed the screen to Reyna. She looked at it for a moment. "Good," she said, then she went back to work. The months that followed were unlike anything the Galactic sovereignty had seen in its long history. It began with the legal brief. After that document had moved through every corner of the galaxy, something shifted. It was not dramatic at first. It was small and quiet, the way all large things begin. Legal scholars started pulling out treaty documents that had sat untouched for centuries. Academics on a dozen worlds started writing papers. Citizens who had never thought to question the shape of the sovereignty's rules started asking their leaders questions that their leaders did not have good answers for. The Kreth were first. War Master Drock stood before his own government's council and read aloud from Clause 44B for the first time in public. He explained what it meant. He explained that for 800 years the Kreth had filed paperwork to move their own ships within their own region of space, while the Founding Five had faced no such requirement. He asked his council if they believed that was right. The answer was not a surprise to anyone, including Drock. It was the asking that mattered. It was the first time anyone had asked. The Sen filed an official objection to 3 separate clauses in their treaty within a month. The Duvari followed with 2. A small species called the Fen, quiet beings who lived on a world of shallow, warm seas, submitted a quiet, careful 17-page document requesting review of their resource-sharing obligations, which had, it turned out, been quietly draining their oceanic reserves for 200 years. The Founding Five tried at first to treat each objection as an individual problem to be managed. They sent diplomats. They offered minor adjustments. They used the old tools that had always worked: patience, authority, the weight of tradition. But the tools did not work the same way anymore, because the tools had always worked on one species at a time in isolation where no one else could see. Now everything was visible. Every objection was shared. Every response was watched. The Transparency of Diplomatic Process Act, Article 33, which Reyna had cited in the brief, turned out to be the most important 3 sentences in the entire Sovereignty Charter. It had been written 11,000 years ago and then largely forgotten because it had never mattered. Now it mattered enormously. Every exchange was on record. Every argument was public. Every inconsistency was visible to everyone. The sovereignty's legal system began to crack. It had been built to process routine business, reports, approvals, standard motions. It had never been designed to process 14 simultaneous treaty disputes filed by member species. The legal office sent a message to the council explaining that its staff was overwhelmed. The council sent a message back asking what they needed. The legal office responded with a list. Someone on that list was a human legal consultant. Marcus Chen, to his own great amusement, found himself officially contracted by the Galactic sovereignty to help them organize their dispute resolution process. "I just want that on record," he said to Reyna, grinning. "They hired me." "Try not to make it weird," she said. "No promises." The formal signing happened on a Tuesday morning, 7 months after Reyna had first walked into the Grand Conclave with a travel cup of tea and a document full of objections. The hall was the same one. The high ceilings, the hanging symbols of member species, the seats full of delegates from dozens of worlds. But the room felt different. It was louder. It had the energy of a place where something real was happening, not just a ceremony being completed. The new induction treaty, humanity's counter-treaty, refined over months of honest negotiation, was 94 pages long, not 847, just 94. Because when you removed the contradictions and the hidden imbalances and the clauses that served only the founding five, it turned out a fair framework did not need to be very long. 31 species signed it on the same day that humanity did, not because they had to, because they chose to re-ratify their membership under the new terms voluntarily, because the document was, by any honest reading, better than what they'd had before. Raina signed for humanity. Her hand was steady. The pen, or the alien equivalent of one, moved across the dark material with a soft sound, and that was that. Humanity was part of the galaxy, on honest terms. The room applauded. All 47 species had different ways of showing approval. Some clapped, some struck the floor with their feet, some produced a low, resonant hum. One species flashed its bioluminescent patches in rapid patterns. Together, it sounded like nothing that had ever been heard before. Raina stood at the table and took it in and felt, in spite of everything, very lucky. War Master Drak gave a speech. He had not been asked to give one. He stood up in the gallery and simply began talking, and the room went quiet because even beings who had never met a Kreth before understood from the first sentence that this was someone who had something real to say. He talked about 800 years. He talked about what it meant to forget that you had a voice. He talked about how it had not happened all at once. It had happened slowly. The way a river changes its course not in a single moment, but over long years of small shifts, until one day you look up and realize the water is going somewhere it was never meant to go. He said that the Kreth had not been defeated by the founding five. They had not been conquered or broken or beaten. They had simply been made to forget, quietly, gradually, through the slow accumulation of documents they never read and rules they never questioned, that they were allowed to speak. And then he said, "We remember now." It was not a dramatic line. He said it simply, the way a person states a fact. But the silence that followed it was the kind that only comes when a room full of people all feel the same thing at exactly the same time. In the gallery, Sorvelon was sitting 3 rows back from Drak. He was a private citizen now. He wore plain clothes. He listened to Drak's words and looked at his own hands in his lap, and the expression on his face was one that he would not have shown publicly a year ago, when he had been the high emissary and composure was a professional requirement. Raina from the front of the room spotted him. Their eyes met across the space between them. She gave him a small nod. He returned it. 3 months later, a new species arrived at the Grand Conclave for the first time. They were called the Forath. They were small, shorter than humans, and they had 6 large eyes arranged in a horizontal line across their heads, which gave them an expression of perpetual wide-eyed wonder. They had achieved faster-than-light travel only 6 years ago, and had spent most of that time simply looking at the size of the universe in stunned silence. Their delegation arrived nervous. It was obvious in the way they walked close together, moving slowly, looking up at the high ceilings and the long corridors with the expression of people who are trying very hard not to look overwhelmed. A sovereignty official met them in the main hall with a warm and practiced greeting. He gestured to the ceremonial table and laid down the document. It was, out of habit, the old standard induction treaty. The official began his speech. It was the same speech that had opened 47 induction ceremonies before. It spoke of tradition, of welcome, of a community across the stars. And then a human diplomat appeared from the side of the room. She was young, younger than Raina had been when all this started, with short dark hair and a calm, friendly expression. She was not part of the official proceedings. She was just there, the way humans often were, because she had been watching the new arrivals come in and had wanted to be nearby. She walked to the table and, without any great announcement, placed a second document beside the first one. "Here's our version," she said to the 4th delegation. "Take your time. Read both of them. Ask us anything you want." She smiled. "There's no rush." The official stared at her. He had not expected this. His carefully prepared schedule did not include this. He opened his mouth. The lead 4th delegate, a small being with all 6 eyes fixed on the 2 documents on the table, spoke first, in a voice that was quiet and careful and very serious. "We are allowed to choose." "Yes," the human said. "We are allowed to ask questions, to say that something is not right." "Always," the human said. "That part was never optional. We just forgot to mention it clearly enough for a long time." She tapped the document she had brought. "So now we write it in, right at the top, page 1. The 4th delegate picked up the human document with both small hands. It was 94 pages. She looked at the cover for a moment, then looked up at the human standing across the table from her. "Then we will read it," she said, "all of it." "Good," the human said simply. Around the hall, in the long corridors and the wide rooms of the Grand Conclave Station, the ordinary business of the galaxy continued. Ships docked and departed. Delegates walked and talked and argued about small things and large ones. The lights hummed softly in the pale walls. The stars outside were the same as they had always been, but the space between them felt just slightly different now. Bigger, somehow, more open, as if something that had been slowly pressing down for a very long time had finally, quietly been lifted.